The rain never truly washed the grime from this part of the city, only spread the shadows thinner, allowing them to cling to the brickwork like persistent, wet moss. It was here, wedged between the skeletal remains of a forgotten warehouse and a dumpster overflowing with the refuse of failed promises, that 8-year-old Ilara found herself. She was small, built of slight bones and wide, fearful eyes that had seen far too much grey for her short tenure on Earth. The three men who had cornered her were the antithesis of the cityscape's indifference. They were actively malevolent, moulded by petty cruelty and the intoxicating belief that their size equated to unchallenged power. Marco was the architect of their immediate menace, a man whose face seemed perpetually set in a sneer, his leather jacket slick with the cold drizzle. Beside him stood Vince, massive and dull, his hands balled into fists that promised blunt trauma. The third, a younger, jumpy individual named Rico, held a flickering, cheap cigarette, his anxiety adding a brittle layer to the cold air. Ilara, pressed against the wet, cold brick, was trapped. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't even truly defied them. She had simply witnessed a transaction, a momentary lapse in their otherwise invisible operations, and in this city, knowledge was a liability punishable by erasure. Marco stepped closer, the scraping sound of his boot on the damp concrete echoing disproportionately loud in the sudden silence. He wasn't loud. The quiet calculation in his voice was far more terrifying. "Where is it, little bird?" he demanded, referring to the discarded cell phone she had momentarily picked up. A device containing nothing more than time-stamped geographical data, but data that could unravel their low-level racket. Ilara shook her head, a tremor running through her frail frame. Her lips barely moved, her voice a fragile sound swallowed instantly by the relentless drumming of the rain on the steel roof above. "Please, help me." It was a whisper, meant for no one, a final, desperate plea thrown into the void of an uncaring metropolis. But they were wrong. They were terribly, catastrophically wrong. They had no idea who was watching, monitoring the thermal signatures of the alley, charting the trajectory of every raindrop, logging the precise frequency of Marco's cruel laugh. They were focused entirely on the small, immediate victim, oblivious to the fact that they themselves had just stepped onto a chessboard, controlled by an invisible, relentless hand. High above the alley, perhaps 300 feet away in the darkened spire of a defunct corporate office building, the observer sat still. He was a silhouette against the city's polluted light pollution, a ghost in the high-altitude gloom. He was not a policeman nor a soldier, but something far more specialized. He was the city's immune system, a self-appointed surgeon dealing in the precise removal of systemic malignancies. For the purposes of his legend, the press called him the architect, though he considered himself merely a keeper of balances. His setup was minimalist, but absolute. 3 4K screens displaying cascading data, environmental readouts, and infrared imaging that sliced through the darkness and the rain. A headset muted the city's roar, leaving only the clinical sound of his own breathing and the faint clicks of the surveillance hardware. The image of the girl, magnified 30 times, occupied the central screen. Her distress was a palpable heat signature, a moral emergency that superseded all other concerns. He had been tracking Marco's small-time operation for weeks, documenting the escalation from intimidation to outright predation. The encounter with Ilara was the line, the uncrossable boundary. The architect did not deal in rage. Rage was inefficient, messy, and prone to error. He dealt in perfect, cold strategy. He moved a gloved hand across a frictionless trackpad, initiating a chain of events so subtle, so perfectly timed, that the men in the alley would initially believe the universe itself was turning against them. The first intervention was auditory. The wrecker's anxiety was already high. Marco was becoming impatient, his voice rising, threatening. Just as he lunged forward, the alley was drowned in sound. Not a siren, not a scream, but a sudden, piercing feedback loop of white noise, calibrated to the exact acoustic resonance of the confined space. It wasn't deafening, but it was disorienting, designed to break concentration and spike the cortisol levels. Marco recoiled, clutching his ears, his momentary fury derailed by confusion. "What the hell was that?" Vince bellowed, his brute certainty shaken. Rico, already jumpy, dropped his cigarette, It fizzled out in a puddle. As he bent down, attempting to salvage the small comfort, the ground around him subtly shifted. A minor, localized tremor, less than half a second long, yet perfectly sufficient to make the abandoned loading dock ramp, which had been stable for 2 decades, suddenly groan and shift. A stack of empty, rusted oil drums, positioned meticulously by the architect minutes before the men arrived, tumbled down. They didn't hit anyone, but they created a sudden, explosive cacophony of banging metal, trapping Rico momentarily between the steel drums and the wall. The entire sequence lasted 4 seconds. The noise stopped. The dust settled. Marco and Vince stood frozen, looking around wildly. Their prey, Ilara, was momentarily forgotten. Their minds, focused on petty violence, lacked the sophistication to recognize engineered chaos. They defaulted to superstition and paranoia. "Someone's messing with us," Marco hissed, scanning the darkened windows of the defunct warehouse. The architect smiled faintly, a grim curve of the lips that rarely reached his eyes. Phase 1. Isolation and psychological pressure was complete. He confirmed Ilara's location. She had instinctively used the moment of distraction to retreat slightly further into the protective shadow of a protruding fire escape ladder. She was still terrified, but she was now momentarily obscured. The next move required precision involving urban infrastructure. The city was a vast, sprawling network of services, utilities, and neglect, a perfect canvas for disruption. The architect toggled an encrypted comm channel to a localized repeater hidden deep within the city's fiber-optic network. He initiated a sequence that would have been impossible for anyone without his resources, or his deep, almost intimate knowledge of the city's forgotten schematics. 2 blocks away, a small unmarked utility van, the wrecker's only means of rapid escape, was parked under a street lamp. Its engine was running, an impatient driver waiting inside. The architect didn't need to approach the vehicle. He merely needed access to the electrical grid it was currently tapping for power. A common illegal siphoning practice the wreckers employed to save gas. Through the grid, using a low-frequency pulse, he targeted the vehicle's electrical system, specifically the high-voltage alternator. The resulting contained short circuit was instantaneous and silent to the outside world. Inside the van, the driver heard a faint pop and smelled ozone. The dashboard lights died. The engine coughed once, then fell silent, refusing to turn over. Panic flared in the driver's eyes. He scrambled out, convinced the vehicle had just spontaneously failed. Back in the alley, Marco pulled out his own burner phone to call the driver, irritation spiking. The call wouldn't connect. The second part of the environmental disruption protocol was underway, targeted communication jamming. The signal interference was only focused on the lower band frequencies used by cheap, untraceable phones. Ilara's small, outdated flip phone, which he had seen earlier, remained untouched. Marco slammed his phone against the brick wall in frustration. "The line's dead. Someone cut the wire." He looked at Vince, his confidence rapidly eroding into baseless aggression. "Grab the girl. Now. We deal with whatever this is later." Vince lumbered forward, his shadow momentarily falling over Ilara. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability, the point where the architect needed to transition from psychological warfare to physical intervention. But the intervention would still be indirect, leveraging the environment against the perpetrators. The warehouse facade against which Ilara was pinned was old and unstable. Directly above Vince, secured by decades of rust and poor maintenance, hung a heavy canvas awning meant to shield the loading bay. The architect had previously identified the 2 weakest bolts supporting the structure. Using a high-powered focused microwave transmitter, not a weapon, but a precision tool operating at a distance, he rapidly heated the specific stress points on the rusted bolts. The metal expanded, then contracted violently. The release was not instantaneous, but delayed by crucial milliseconds. As Vince reached for Ilara, the entire awning tore free with a sudden sickening squeal of shearing metal. It did not fall directly onto Vince. That would have violated the no-gore directive and invited unnecessary risk. Instead, it fell outward, creating a massive, terrifying curtain of heavy, damp canvas and steel supports that slammed into the ground between Vince and the terrified girl. The impact shook the concrete. Vince roared in surprise, stumbling backward, effectively blocked by the unexpected steel partition. The wreckers were now physically divided and mentally shattered. The unseen force was not attacking them, it was simply isolating them, making the environment hostile, reminding them of their fragility and insignificance against the vast, indifferent mechanics of the city. Ilara saw her chance. The commotion had created a momentary gap, a passage of light and sound between the attackers. She scrambled, moving with the speed of pure instinct, not towards the main street but deeper into the shadows, towards the one area Marco had considered too dense and difficult to navigate, the narrow, unlit space between the warehouse wall and a chain-link fence. Marco saw her escape, his face twisted into a mask of pure, frustrated spite. He ordered Vince to lift the heavy awning, but the sheer weight of the object coupled with the slick ground made it impossible for the brute to move quickly. Marco turned to Rico, who was still trying to untangle himself from the pile of oil drums. "Rico, go, get her!" Rico, seizing the chance to prove his worth after the earlier failure, scrambled free and sprinted into the gap after Ilara. He was fast, and the girl was struggling on the uneven ground. The chase was now a pure, visceral pursuit. And this, the architect knew, was the most dangerous moment. Rico entered the space between the fence and the wall, his heavy breathing audible even from the architect's vantage point. Ilara could hear his pounding footsteps closing the distance. She was running on fear alone. The architect had anticipated this route. This area, less than 3 feet wide, was crossed overhead by a dense network of electrical conduit and ventilation pipes, all ignored, all forgotten, all under the city's blanket of neglect. As Rico entered the critical zone, the architect triggered the final, localized environmental trap. A low-powered, concentrated burst of compressed air sourced from a nearby maintenance exhaust vent that the architect had rerouted hours ago blasted the immediate area. It wasn't powerful enough to injure, but it was enough to momentarily obscure vision and throw off balance. More importantly, it was directed precisely at a brittle section of a large, disused HVAC pipe directly above Rico's head. The pipe section, weakened by years of decay, fractured. It did not fall, but it released a sudden, voluminous plume of fine, grey, non-toxic dust, decades of accumulated city grit, directly into the enclosed space. Rico inhaled a lungful of the dry, suffocating dust. He choked violently, his run broken instantly. Blinded and wheezing, he stumbled, his outstretched hand catching the chain-link fence, which the architect had already charged with a harmless but utterly shocking static discharge harvested from a nearby industrial capacitor. The electrical shock was instantaneous and sharp, causing Rico's muscles to seize, harmlessly throwing him to the ground in a pathetic tangle of limbs and coughing fits. He wasn't injured, but he was neutralized, convinced he had been struck by lightning or electrocuted by a falling power line. Ilara, now free of immediate pursuit, burst out of the narrow corridor and found herself in a smaller, adjacent street, dimly lit by a malfunctioning sodium lamp. She was safe for the moment. The architect tracked her retreating figure, confirming her path towards a known, well-patrolled route, frequented by late-shift delivery drivers, a route where she would soon be spotted and secured by the legitimate eyes of the city. His immediate objective, the girl's safety, was accomplished. But the matter of the wreckers was far from concluded. Justice, the architect knew, was not just the rescue of the victim, but the precise moral ruin of the aggressor. Marco and Vince were still struggling with the fallen awning in the alley. Their initial bravado was gone, replaced by a cold, animal fear. They understood they were not dealing with a rival gang or a disgruntled member of the community. They were dealing with something smarter, faster, and utterly invisible. Marco pulled out a hunting knife, his last resort. "Come on out, show yourself," he screamed, his voice raw with terror, echoing pointlessly against the tall, silent walls. The architect addressed them not with sound, but with sensation. The air in the alley, already cold, suddenly began to plummet in temperature. The rain hitting the concrete sizzled slightly, beginning to freeze almost instantly. The effect was localized, focused on the precise dimensions of the loading dock. This was his signature move, perfected over years. An extreme localized temperature drop achieved by triggering a massive, targeted release of pressurized nitrogen gas from a series of discarded industrial tanks strategically placed and networked in the defunct warehouse days prior. The cold was debilitating, a physical shock that sapped strength and willpower. Vince, whose coat offered little protection, began to shiver violently. his thick fingers turning numb and purple. Marco's movement slowed, his breath plumed thick and white. The cold wasn't just physical, it was psychological, simulating the profound, sudden drop in temperature felt during a near-death experience. In the midst of the freezing air, a single directional spotlight flared to life, originating from a window 20 feet up in the warehouse wall. It was a searing white light, focused only on a specific spot on the ground, the wet concrete patch where Ilara had been cornered just minutes before. And in that patch of light, etched into the grime by the sudden freezing temperature, a message. The architect had used a small remote-controlled etching device, deploying a burst of supercooled liquid to instantly vaporize the top layer of dirt, leaving a clean, simple message, visible only for a few agonizing seconds before the moisture froze over. "I watched you choose cruelty." The sight of the message, combined with the paralyzing cold and the utter helplessness of their situation, broke Marco's resolve. This was not a fight he could win with a knife. This was a judgment delivered by something that understood his every movement, his every intention. He was being punished not physically but through absolute surgical control. The light snapped off. The extreme cold retreated, though a residual lingering chill remained. The nitrogen tanks were empty. The lesson delivered. Marco dropped the knife. He didn't run. He simply sank onto his knees, the realization of the vastness of the unseen opponent crushing him entirely. Vince, meanwhile, was curled into a fetal position, whimpering, his body exhausted by the sudden terrifying exposure to the manufactured cold. The architect, satisfied with the immobilization, initiated the final phase. He did not call the police directly. That would reveal his methods and risk his own position. Instead, he utilized the city's vast open-source data network. Within seconds, a fully documented anonymous package was compiled, thermal imagery of the men's illegal activities, a transcript of their threats against a minor, and the exact coordinates of their disabled escape vehicle. This data, packaged as a high-priority citizen tip, with impeccable evidence, was dropped directly into the precinct's crime reporting system, guaranteeing a swift, unavoidable response from legitimate authorities. The men would be found immobilized and psychologically scarred, but physically unharmed. Their narrative of being attacked by an unseen force would be dismissed as the rambling of petty criminals under distress. They would be processed by the system they thought they were above. Moral accountability delivered. High above, the architect watched the flickering blue and red light of the approaching patrol car, reflecting off the low cloud base. He began the systematic shutdown and sterilization of his perch. Every piece of equipment was retracted, every data log wiped clean. His presence in the office spire had been temporary, utilizing a subleased, ghosted space, a room that would be empty again within minutes, leaving no trace but the faint, residual scent of ozone. He paused only to review the final satellite image of Ilara. She had been found by a late-night baker making his rounds, wrapped in a blanket, sobbing but safe, giving a description of loud noises and cold wind to the kind stranger. She would be safe. Her trauma would fade, replaced by a confused memory of a terrifying night where the world seemed to shift just for her. The architect knew the cycle was endless. The darkness of the city was a deep well, and Marco and his crew were just small ephemeral shadows. There would be others. The system would always fail, leaving gaps in the defense of the innocent. And as long as those gaps existed, as long as the smallest voice whispered a desperate plea into the silence, the architect would be there. He stood up, shedding the heavy tactical gear, blending back into the anonymity of the forgotten office space. His mission was complete, the moral balance restored. He was simply a line of defense, a promise kept to the quiet, frightened inhabitants of the endless, indifferent metropolis. He was the consequence nobody saw coming, the watcher in the high dark, the quiet guarantor that sometimes when you corner the innocent, you don't just invite trouble, you invite judgment. He left the cold spire, descending into the heart of the indifferent city, melting into the throng of late-night workers and early morning runners. Just another shadow. The rain had finally stopped, and the city, for one small moment, felt just a fraction cleaner, awaiting the inevitable return of the darkness and the necessary response of the silent protector. The night was vast, and the work was eternal. He moved on, already calculating the next disturbance, anticipating the next failure of the light. The city was safe for now, but the true crime was never the action. It was the cruel intent, and that intent required constant, vigilant monitoring. He was ready.